Welcome to the sinister side, where dark stories and hidden truths come to light. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and what time of day it is for you. Now, let's uncover the sinister side. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a chilling story. William Wells Brown entered the world around 1814, not as a child welcomed into a family, but as property recorded in another man's account. His birth did not come with a name chosen in love or a future imagined with hope. It came with an assumption already fixed by law and custom, that his life belonged to someone else. He was born in Kentucky to an enslaved woman named Elizabeth, and from the first breath he took, the rules of slavery wrapped around him tighter than any blanket ever could. His father was a white man, a relative of his enslaver, but that blood connection offered no protection. In the slave system, white paternity did not grant recognition, inheritance, or mercy. Instead, it often deepened cruelty. A child who visibly carried the features of his oppressor was a living reminder of exploitation, violence, and hypocrisy. For William, this meant growing up knowing that the man who could have acknowledged him as a son instead allowed him to be treated as livestock. Schools often summarize this fact in a single sentence, but they rarely pause on what it meant emotionally. To know that your very existence was proof of a crime, yet you were the one punished for it. William's earliest memories were shaped by instability. He was not raised in one place or by one owner. Enslaved children were frequently hired out, traded, or sold, and William was no exception. One moment he belonged to a household, the next, he was sent away to work for someone else. Each transfer meant new rules, new punishments, and new fears. There was no such thing as childhood innocence in slavery. From a very young age, William learned to read faces, moods, and tones of voice. Survival depended on anticipating anger before it erupted. His mother, Elizabeth, was the closest thing he had to safety, but even that bond was fragile. Enslaved mothers had no legal rights over their children. At any moment, a sale could separate them forever. William watched this happen to others, children clinging to their mothers, screaming as they were dragged away, their cries fading as wagons rolled on. These scenes were not rare or shocking events, they were routine. They taught him early that love under slavery was dangerous because it could be taken without warning. One of the most damaging lies about slavery taught in sanitized versions of history is the idea of the benevolent master. William Wells Brown's childhood destroys that myth. Even when an enslaver was not openly sadistic, the system itself was violent. A child could be whipped for dropping a tool, beaten for speaking without permission, or starved as punishment for mistakes that any child would naturally make. William experienced hunger not as an accident, but as discipline. Food was control, clothing was control, sleep was control, renaming was another form of violence. Enslaved people were often given the names of their owners, reinforcing the idea that they were extensions of someone else's identity. William did not choose the name he was born with, and later in life he would choose his own name as an act of rebellion. But as a child, his name could change depending on who claimed ownership of him. This constant erasure of identity sent a clear message: you are replaceable, interchangeable, and forgettable. As he grew older, William became increasingly aware that his treatment had nothing to do with his behavior or worth. He saw enslaved people punished even when they obeyed orders perfectly. He saw cruelty delivered calmly, without anger, simply because the system allowed it. This realization was critical. Slavery was not about discipline or work ethic, it was about power. Understanding this truth planted the first seeds of resistance in his mind. The emotional weight of being considered property shaped William's inner world. Enslaved children were taught to suppress emotions because crying could invite punishment. Fear became constant, but it had to be hidden. Anger was dangerous, curiosity would be fatal. William learned to appear obedient while thinking independently, a skill that would later define his writing and activism. Long before he ever held a pen, he was observing, remembering, and silently recording the injustices around him. Religion was often used to justify slavery, and William encountered this hypocrisy early. He watched white enslavers pray, quote scripture, and speak of Christian virtue, then turn around and beat human beings without remorse. These contradictions confused him at first, then enraged him. The idea that God sanctioned such cruelty did not sit easily in his mind. This internal conflict would later fuel his sharp critiques of American Christianity, especially as practiced in slaveholding states. What schools often fail to explain is how deeply psychological the violence of slavery was, especially for children. William was not just physically controlled, he was conditioned to doubt his own humanity. Enslaved children were told they were inferior, lazy, and incapable of intelligence. These lies were repeated so often that many internalized them. William resisted this internal destruction, but not without struggle. He later wrote about moments of despair, of feeling trapped in a world designed to crush any sense of self-worth. Despite being denied formal education, William's mind was active and alert. He listened carefully to conversations between white people, absorbing language, ideas, and contradictions. He noticed how laws were discussed, how business was conducted, and how enslaved people were spoken about as numbers rather than lives. This accidental education began in childhood, long before his escape. His intellect was not discovered later, it was forged early, under pressure. One of the most painful aspects of William's early life was realizing that the law itself was his enemy. There was no authority he could appeal to if he was beaten unjustly. No court would hear his pain, no official would defend him. This knowledge created a deep understanding that freedom was not just the absence of chains, but the presence of rights. Without rights, life was always conditional, always temporary. As a child, William also witnessed the commodification of black bodies in markets and auctions. He saw human beings inspected like animals, their teeth checked, muscles examined, prices negotiated. Even if he was not sold in those moments, the message was clear: he could be. This constant threat shaped how he saw the future, not as something to plan, but as something to endure. By the end of his childhood, William Wells Brown had already lived through experiences that would break many adults. He had seen families destroyed, violence normalized, faith corrupted, and identity stripped away. Yet within him, something survived: a quiet refusal to believe the lies told about his worth, a growing awareness that the system enslaving him was neither natural nor just. This first chapter of his life is often rushed through in classrooms, reduced to a few dates and facts. But without understanding this beginning, it is impossible to understand the man William Wells Brown became. His later courage, intelligence, and moral clarity did not appear suddenly after freedom. They were shaped in the darkest conditions, where every day of survival was an act of resistance. By the time William Wells Brown was sent to work on the Mississippi River, he was no longer just a child learning cruelty in fragments. He was being placed inside the very machinery of slavery at its most efficient and most brutal. The river was not merely a body of water cutting through the American landscape, it was an artery through which enslaved lives were transported, traded, discarded, and erased. For Brown, the Mississippi became a moving classroom where the true scale and organization of slavery revealed itself in full. Steamboats were symbols of American progress. Newspapers celebrated them as miracles of modern engineering, proof that the nation was advancing toward prosperity and power. But beneath the polished decks and billowing smoke, these boats functioned as floating prisons. Brown worked as a cabin boy and general laborer, performing exhausting tasks from dawn until night. His labor kept the illusion of elegance alive for white passengers who dined, laughed, and spoke freely above him, rarely acknowledging the enslaved people who made their comfort possible. The Mississippi River connected slave states and markets like a conveyor belt. Enslaved people were constantly being moved southward, especially to places like Mississippi and Louisiana, where cotton plantations demanded endless labor. Brown watched chained men and women loaded onto boats, their destinations unknown to them, their families often left behind forever. The river swallowed their cries, carrying them toward lives of harsher labor and higher mortality rates. This was not accidental movement, it was systematic relocation designed to maximize profit. What schools often fail to emphasize is how normalized this violence was. The buying and selling of humans happened openly, without shame. Traders discussed prices over meals. Contracts were signed casually. Brown overheard these conversations while serving drinks or carrying luggage. He learned that enslaved people were categorized by age, strength, and obedience, reduced to statistics in ledgers. The casual tone with which lives were traded disturbed him more deeply than the whippings. Cruelty delivered calmly, without rage, revealed something far more terrifying. On the river, Brown saw slavery stripped of its domestic mask. Plantation owners sometimes claimed paternal care for those they enslaved, presenting themselves as guardians. But the river trade exposed the lie. Enslaved people transported by boat were not members of a household, they were cargo. They were packed into cramped spaces, poorly fed, and guarded constantly. Disease spread quickly below deck. When someone became too sick to be valuable, they were sometimes abandoned at ports or, in the most extreme cases, thrown overboard. Brown witnessed bodies disappear into the river without ceremony, as if a defective tool had been discarded. Mississippi, in particular, left a lasting imprint on Brown's understanding of slavery. The state was expanding rapidly, its wealth built almost entirely on cotton and coerced labor. As steamboats docked at Mississippi ports, Brown saw entire couples of enslaved people marched off toward plantations. He noticed how the soil seemed to demand blood as much as seed. The farther south the boats traveled, the harsher the conditions became. Overseers grew more violent, punishments more extreme, and resistance more dangerous. The river also revealed the national scope of slavery. It was not a regional oddity or a backward tradition clinging to the past. It was integrated into American commerce, transportation, and finance. Northern businessmen invested in southern plantations. Northern factories processed southern cotton. Northern passengers traveled on boats powered by enslaved labor. Brown understood that slavery was not just a southern sin, it was an American one. This realization later shaped his writing, which refused to let the North claim moral innocence. One of the most formative experiences for Brown was listening. On steamboats, white men spoke openly, assuming enslaved workers were incapable of understanding or remembering. Brown listened to politicians discuss states' rights, to businessmen complain about tariffs, and to preachers justify slavery using scripture. He heard jokes about enslaved people suffering and casual boasts about breaking human beings into obedience. These conversations revealed the intellectual architecture of slavery, the arguments used to defend it, the lies repeated to sustain it. Brown learned that violence was not a failure of the system, it was its foundation. He saw enslaved people whipped publicly to set examples. He saw children separated from parents at docks, their screams dismissed as inconveniences delaying business. He saw women assaulted with impunity, their pain invisible in the legal system. On the river, there were no witnesses who mattered, no courts to appeal to, no communities to intervene. The water carried everything away. Yet even in this environment, Brown observed resistance. Sometimes it was subtle, an enslaved person pretending not to understand an order, breaking a tool, or slowing work just enough to reclaim a fragment of control. Sometimes it was desperate, attempted escapes at ports, leaps into the river, acts of defiance punished with savage force. Brown saw the cost of resistance, but he also saw its necessity. These acts contradicted the lie that enslaved people accepted their condition. The Mississippi River also exposed Brown to the fragility of white authority. Steamboats were dangerous, explosions, fires, and accidents were common. In moments of crisis, racial hierarchies sometimes collapsed. White passengers panicked. Orders became confused. Enslaved workers were suddenly relied upon for survival. Brown noticed how quickly the illusion of absolute control dissolved when technology failed. This planted another dangerous idea in his mind. Power was not natural or permanent. It depended on conditions that could change. As a young man, Brown began to connect what he saw on the river to his own future. He realized that as cotton production expanded, demand for enslaved labor would only increase. His chances of being sold south permanently grew with each passing year. Mississippi was not just a place he passed through, it was a warning. To be sent there was often a death sentence. This knowledge sharpened his desire for freedom from a vague longing into a strategic necessity. The river also influenced Brown's understanding of time. Slavery tried to trap people in an endless present of labor and obedience. But on the Mississippi, movement was constant. Ports came and went, faces changed. Brown learned to think in terms of opportunity, brief windows where escape or resistance might be possible. This mindset later proved crucial when he finally fled slavery. Freedom, he understood, was not a single dramatic moment. It was something seized inch by inch. Emotionally, the river hardened Brown without destroying him. Repeated exposure to suffering could numb a person or radicalize them. In Brown's case, it did both in different ways. He learned to mask his feelings to survive, but inside, his sense of injustice grew sharper. He began to see himself not only as a victim, but as a witness. Someone had to remember what happened on those boats, at those docks, along those muddy banks. Someone had to tell the truth. The Mississippi River was also where Brown's moral clarity deepened. He saw that kindness from individual white. Deeply the nation depended on it. Without the Mississippi River, Brown might have remained trapped in a smaller world of individual cruelty. Because of it, he saw the whole machine. This was the floating prison that shaped him, a moving landscape of chains and commerce, hypocrisy and horror. The Mississippi did not just carry cotton and passengers, it carried the truth of American slavery, and William Wells Brown carried that truth with him for the rest of his life. By the time William Wells Brown was forced deeper into plantation life, he had already seen slavery at work in households and on the Mississippi River. What awaited him next was even more revealing, because here slavery showed its true backbone, the overseer system and the law that protected it. If the river exposed slavery as an industry, the plantation revealed it as a regime, one ruled by fear, punishment, and legal silence. On plantations, power did not rest only in the hands of owners. It was delegated to overseers, men hired specifically to extract maximum labor through intimidation and violence. Overseers were not chosen for their compassion or judgment. They were chosen for their willingness to whip, starve, threaten, and terrorize. For William, this was a critical realization. Cruelty was not a personality flaw of a few bad men. It was a job requirement. Overseers often lived among the enslaved, watching constantly, listening for whispers, measuring productivity by the pound of cotton picked or the row of crops cleared. Every movement was monitored. Every pause could be interpreted as laziness or rebellion. William learned quickly that survival required not only physical endurance, but emotional control. A wrong expression on his face, a tone of voice that sounded too confident or too slow, could invite punishment. Whippings were not spontaneous bursts of anger. They were calculated tools of management. Overseers used them to set examples, often punishing one person publicly to frighten dozens of others into obedience. William witnessed these spectacles repeatedly. Enslaved people were tied to posts or trees, their backs exposed, their screams ignored. The sound of the whip carried across fields like a warning bell. Everyone learned to associate pain with productivity. What schools often avoid explaining is how normalized this violence was. Plantation schedules included time for punishment, just as they included time for meals or rest. Records were kept. Whippings were discussed without embarrassment. Overseers were rarely reprimanded for excessive brutality unless it resulted in the death of valuable property. Even then, consequences were minimal. The enslaved person's suffering was irrelevant, only financial loss mattered. William saw how overseers cultivated fear deliberately. They exaggerated punishments, spread rumors of torture, and made examples of those who resisted. Children were not spared. Young boys and girls were beaten to teach obedience early. The goal was not correction, it was conditioning. By breaking people young, the system hoped to prevent resistance later. William carried the memory of these lessons deeply, understanding that slavery was a long-term psychological assault. The law stood firmly behind the overseers. In Mississippi and other slave states, enslaved people had no legal standing. They could not testify against white people, they could not file complaints, they could not claim assault, rape, or theft. The law defined them as property, and property had no voice. This legal silence was one of the most violent aspects of slavery. It meant that every act of cruelty was protected, not hidden. William began to understand something crucial. Slavery did not survive despite the law, it survived because of it. Legislators, judges, sheriffs, and patrols all played roles in maintaining the system. Slave patrols roamed the countryside at night, stopping black people, demanding passes, beating or killing those found outside planta. Chians, without permission. These patrols were early forms of organized policing designed explicitly to control enslaved populations. On plantations, punishments extended beyond whippings. Food rations were reduced, sleep was denied. Families were separated as discipline. A husband could be sold away from his wife. A child could be taken from its mother. These were not tragic accidents, they were deliberate strategies. William saw how emotional bonds were treated as weaknesses to be exploited. Love itself became a liability. Overseers often justified their actions using language borrowed from religion and science. They spoke of enslaved people as naturally lazy, childlike, or dangerous. Violence, they claimed, was necessary for order. William listened carefully to these justifications, noting how easily cruelty dressed itself in logic. This awareness sharpened his later writing, which dismantled these arguments one by one with lived experience rather than theory. One of the most disturbing realizations for William was that many overseers were poor white men. They did not own land or slaves themselves, yet they enforced the system with extraordinary loyalty. Why? Because the system gave them power over someone else. Even at the bottom of white society, they were elevated above every enslaved person. This hierarchy kept poor whites invested in slavery, turning them into its most violent defenders. William also noticed how owners distanced themselves from daily brutality. They hired overseers so they could maintain a self-image of respectability. When violence occurred, they blamed the overseer, even though they set the expectations. This separation allowed slaveholders to claim moral superiority while benefiting fully from terrorized labor. William learned to see this as one of slavery's most insidious tricks. The emotional toll of plantation life was immense. Constant surveillance created a state of permanent tension. Enslaved people were denied privacy, rest, and safety. William learned to sleep lightly, always ready to wake at the sound of footsteps. Dreams offered no escape. Fear followed into sleep. This chronic stress aged people quickly. William saw young men with the exhaustion of elders, women worn down long before their time, yet even under this regime, enslaved people found ways to resist. Resistance did not always look like open rebellion. It appeared in slowed work, broken tools, secret gatherings, stolen moments of rest, whispered songs carrying coded messages. William observed these acts carefully. He understood that resistance was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply refusing to let the system claim one's inner life. Punishment for resistance was severe, but it did not eliminate defiance. This taught William another lesson. Violence could control bodies, but it could not fully control minds. The overseers knew this, which is why they targeted education so fiercely. Reading and writing were forbidden because knowledge threatened the system. An educated enslaved person could imagine a different future. That imagination was dangerous. William's experiences on plantations also reshaped his understanding of masculinity and power. He saw how violence was used to humiliate men, to strip them of dignity in front of families and communities. Enslaved men were punished publicly to demonstrate that they could not protect themselves or others. This psychological attack aimed to destroy leadership and solidarity. William recognized this strategy and remembered it. Women suffered uniquely brutal forms of violence. Sexual assault was common and rarely acknowledged. Overseers and owners abused enslaved women knowing they faced no consequences. Children born from these assaults were added to the enslaved population, increasing wealth for the enslaver. William witnessed the pain and silence surrounding these crimes. He understood that slavery corrupted every relationship it touched. The law's silence extended to death. If an enslaved person died under punishment, investigations were rare and superficial. Juries composed of white men often ruled deaths accidental or justified. William learned that the law was not blind. It was selective. It saw only what benefited those in power. This realization destroyed any remaining illusion he might have had about justice under slavery. Over time, William began to connect his observations into a larger understanding. Slavery was maintained by three pillars: economic incentive, legal protection, and psychological terror. Remove one, and the system weakened. This analytical framework did not come from books or lectures, it came from watching people suffer and asking why it was allowed to continue. These lessons hardened William's resolve. He knew that escape alone was not enough. The system had to be exposed. The overseer's whips, the lawmaker's silence, and the owner's hypocrisy all needed to be named. Silence protected cruelty. Testimony threatened it. Long before he became a writer, William Wells Brown was gathering evidence in his mind. Schools often portray slavery as a tragic chapter, driven by ignorance or prejudice. William's life tells a harsher truth. Slavery was intelligent, organized, and defended by law. It knew exactly what it was doing. Understanding this is uncomfortable, which is why much of it is softened or skipped in classrooms. By surviving the overseer system and witnessing the law's complicity, William Wells Brown gained something dangerous: clarity. He no longer believed in accidental cruelty or isolated injustice. He saw a system designed to break human beings and call it order. That clarity would later fuel his escape, his writing, and his relentless challenge to American hypocrisy. This was the world that shaped him. Not chaos, but structure. Not random violence, but sanctioned brutality. And once William Wells Brown understood that truth, there was no unseeing it. By the time William Wells Brown entered adulthood, he had learned something that terrified the system holding him captive. Education did not begin or end with books. Slavery tried to starve the mind as thoroughly as it starved the body, but Brown discovered that observation itself could become a form of learning. Denied the right to read or write openly, he turned the world around him into a living text, studying people, power, and contradiction with relentless attention. Plantations and steamboats were not just places of labor, they were theaters of American life. Brown watched closely. He noticed how white men spoke differently depending on who was listening. Among themselves they admitted fears, doubts, and greed. In front of enslaved people, they performed confidence and authority. Brown learned to separate performance from truth. This skill, developed under necessity, later became one of his greatest intellectual strengths. Listening became his classroom. While serving meals or standing silently nearby, Brown absorbed conversations about politics, law, and economics. He heard white men argue passionately about freedom from British tyranny, the sanctity of property rights, and the dangers of government overreach. These discussions fascinated him, not because he agreed, but because of the glaring contradiction they revealed. The same men who praised liberty denied it completely to others. Brown began to understand that American ideals were often spoken as abstractions, detached from the lives they affected. Because enslaved people were assumed to be ignorant, white society rarely guarded its language around them. Brown exploited this blindness. He memorized phrases, arguments, and stories. He noticed patterns in how enslavers justified themselves. Slavery was defended as a necessary evil, a natural order, or a benevolent institution. Brown tested these claims against reality. Nothing he saw supported them. The gap between rhetoric and reality became impossible to ignore. Religion, in particular, drew his scrutiny. Brown watched enslavers pray with fervor, attend church regularly, and quote scripture with confidence. He also watched those same men whip human beings, break families apart, and profit from sexual violence. Ministers preached obedience to enslaved congregations while dining at the tables of slaveholders. Brown concluded that religion, as practiced within slavery, had been twisted into a tool of control. Faith was used not to challenge injustice, but to sanctify it. Denied formal schooling, Brown learned letters and words in secret and in fragments. Sometimes he was taught by sympathetic individuals. More often, he taught himself by watching others read. He memorized the shapes of letters, the sounds of words, and the rhythm of language. Learning to read was dangerous. In many places, it was illegal. Punishment could be severe. Yet the risk itself underscored the importance of knowledge. If reading was dangerous, it was because it was powerful. Brown's education was not only intellectual, it was psychological. He studied fear, how it was created, maintained, and exploited. He noticed how enslaved people were kept exhausted, so they would not have the energy to think. How constant surveillance prevented planning. how unpredictable punishment destroyed trust. Understanding these tactics helped him resist them internally. Even when his body was controlled, his mind began to feel less captive. He also studied solidarity. Enslaved communities shared information quietly, passing warnings, news, and strategies through songs, gestures, and coded language. Brown learned to read these signals. He saw how knowledge circulated beneath the surface, invisible to overseers who underestimated the intelligence of those they enslaved. This underground exchange of information convinced Brown that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active thinkers navigating extreme constraints. Travel exposed Brown to regional differences that sharpened his analysis. On steamboats, he encountered Northerners who opposed slavery in theory but benefited from it in practice. They criticized Southern brutality while wearing clothes made from slave-grown cotton and investing in slave-backed enterprises. Brown recognized this hypocrisy immediately. Opposition that did not require sacrifice struck him as hollow. This realization later shaped his critique of Northern complicity. Brown also learned by watching how enslavers reacted to resistance. Even minor acts of defiance produced disproportionate fear. A rumor of rebellion could mobilize patrols and militias. A missing enslaved person could cause panic across counties. This fear revealed something important. Slavery was not secure. It depended on constant enforcement because it was fundamentally unstable. Brown realized that the system survived not because it was strong, but because it was terrified of collapse. Language itself became a subject of study. Brown noticed how words were used to soften brutality. Whippings became corrections. Sales became transfers. Enslaved people were called hands or stock. This linguistic camouflage fascinated him. It showed how violence was hidden in plain sight, normalized through vocabulary. Later, as a writer, Brown would deliberately strip away these euphemisms, naming acts for what they were. One of Brown's most important intellectual developments during this period was his understanding of history. Enslaved people were told they had no past worth remembering. Brown rejected this lie. He listened to elders tell stories of Africa, of resistance, of lost relatives. He understood that memory itself was a form of resistance. Forgetting served the enslaver, remembering strengthened the enslaved. Brown began to see himself as a keeper of stories even before he could write them down. Despite his growing awareness, Brown struggled internally. Knowledge did not bring immediate freedom. In fact, it sometimes increased suffering. Understanding unjust, ice without the power to change it, could feel unbearable. Brown experienced moments of despair, questioning whether awareness was a gift or a curse. Yet even in these moments, he refused to surrender his mind. He concluded that ignorance was a deeper prison than chains. Brown's developing intellect also changed how he saw himself. Slavery insisted that he was inferior by nature. His observations contradicted this daily. He saw intelligence, creativity, and resilience everywhere among enslaved people. He saw cruelty, cowardice, and moral emptiness among many enslavers. These comparisons shattered the logic of racial hierarchy. Brown did not need scientific arguments to reject white supremacy. Lived experience had already disproven it. As his confidence grew, so did the danger he posed. An enslaved person who thought critically was a threat. Brown learned to conceal his intelligence, presenting himself as obedient and unremarkable. This double life, appearing compliant while thinking freely, was exhausting but necessary. It was also training. Later, as a fugitive and activist, Brown would rely on the same skill to navigate hostile environments. This period of self-education transformed Brown's understanding of freedom. Freedom was not simply the absence of chains, it was the ability to think, speak, and act without fear. Many white Americans, he realized, were not truly free despite their legal status. They were trapped by prejudice, greed, and moral compromise. This insight complicated his vision of liberation. He did not want to trade one form of bondage for another. Brown's intellectual awakening also gave him purpose. He began to feel that survival alone was not enough. Witnessing injustice created responsibility. Someone had to tell the truth. Someone had to connect personal suffering to national identity. Brown sensed, even before escape, that his life might serve a larger role. This sense of calling did not come from prophecy or ego, but from necessity. Silence allowed cruelty to continue. Schools often present education as something given by institutions. William Wells Brown's life challenges that idea. His education was stolen in fragments, earned through risk, and sharpened by suffering. It was not gentle or orderly. It was forged under threat. This makes it easy to overlook, but also impossible to dismiss. Brown did not become intelligent after freedom, he became dangerous before it. By the time he began seriously considering escape, Brown's mind was already free in crucial ways. He understood the system that bound him, the lies that justified it, and the fears that sustained it. This knowledge did not guarantee success, but it made escape imaginable. Without imagination, freedom could not exist. Slavery worked hard to destroy imagination. Brown preserved this chapter of his life is rarely given full weight because it is difficult to measure. There are no diplomas, no classrooms, no formal teachers. Yet this was the period in which William Wells Brown became who he truly was. Not just a survivor, but a thinker. Not just a witness, but an analyst. Not just an enslaved man longing for freedom, but a future writer preparing, silently, to expose a nation to itself. When William Wells Brown finally decided to escape slavery, it was not a moment of sudden bravery sparked by a single event. It was the slow, heavy result of everything he had seen, learned, and endured. Escape was not romantic in his mind. It was not a leap into freedom bathed in hope. It was a calculation made under pressure, knowing that failure meant torture, sail deeper south, or death. By the time he acted, he understood that remaining enslaved was not survival, it was a delayed erasure. The opportunity came in 1834, through circumstances that were as fragile as they were rare. Brown's owner was traveling, and Brown was hired out to assist a man who opposed slavery, a Quaker whose beliefs clashed sharply with the system surrounding him. This N did something quietly radical. He treated Brown as a human being, not as property, not as labor, but as someone capable of choice. He offered help, not commands. For Brown this was shocking. Kindness alone did not free him, but it revealed a truth slavery tried to bury, that another way of living was possible. The decision to flee was terrifying. Brown knew the geography, the patrols, the laws. He knew that fugitive slave laws extended beyond state lines, that slave catchers made their living hunting men like him. Escape did not simply mean crossing into a free state. It meant living under constant threat, knowing that any white person could betray him for money. Freedom, he understood, was conditional and fragile. Leaving meant abandoning everything familiar, including people he loved. Escape required secrecy. He could not tell most enslaved people his plans without endangering them and himself. This isolation was one of the cruelest parts of the process. Slavery forced people to choose between connection and survival. Brown carried the weight of that choice heavily. Knowing that his freedom would come at the cost of separation, when he finally fled, there were no dramatic chases or cinematic moments. There was fear, silence, and careful movement. Brown traveled north, relying on luck, discretion, and the help of abolitionists who risked their own safety to assist fugitives. Each step forward carried the possibility of capture. Every knock, every unfamiliar voice, every sudden movement could be the end. He learned quickly that freedom required constant vigilance. Crossing into a free state did not bring immediate relief. Brown discovered that freedom on paper did not equal safety in practice. Slave catchers operated openly in northern states, backed by law and profit. Free black people were frequently kidnapped and sold into slavery. Brown understood that his skin marked him as a target regardless of his legal status. The North was not a sanctuary, it was contested ground. Emotionally, freedom was disorienting. Brown had lived his entire life under surveillance. Suddenly he had choices, but no clear sense of how to use them. Simple decisions, where to go, what to eat, when to rest, felt overwhelming. Slavery had stripped away autonomy so completely that reclaiming it required relearning how to exist. Freedom was not a door opening, it was a muscle that had to be rebuilt. Brown also faced a painful truth: freedom did not erase trauma. The memories of whippings, screams, and losses did not vanish when chains were removed. Nightmares followed him. Loud noises triggered fear. Authority figures inspired instinctive caution. Brown carried slavery inside him, even as he tried to leave it behind. This psychological residue is rarely discussed in classrooms, but it shaped his early years as a free man deeply. Work was another challenge. Brown took jobs wherever he could, often menial and poorly paid. Freedom did not guarantee dignity. Racism limited opportunities, wages, and mobility. He encountered white Northerners who opposed slavery but still believed black people were inferior. Their support came with conditions and condescension. Brown learned quickly that abolition did not always mean equality. Despite these obstacles, freedom sharpened Brown's sense of responsibility. He could not forget those still enslaved. Each moment of relative safety carried guilt and urgency. Why him and not others? Why now and not earlier? These questions haunted him. Instead of paralyzing him, they pushed him toward action. Brown began to speak, quietly at first, sharing his experiences with abolitionist groups who recognized the power of first-hand testimony. Telling his story was risky. Public speaking exposed him to identification and capture. Slave catchers attended abolitionist meetings, rewards were posted. Brown had to weigh the danger of silence against the danger of speaking. He chose speech. This choice marked a turning point. He was no longer just a fugitive seeking safety. He was becoming a witness challenging a nation's conscience. Brown's experiences as a fugitive taught him that freedom required community. Alone, he was vulnerable. Supported by networks of abolitionists, free black communities, and sympathetic whites, he found protection and purpose. These networks were fragile and imperfect, but they represented something slavery could not tolerate: cooperation across racial and moral lines. Brown saw in them a model of resistance larger than any individual escape. The Fugitive Slave Act loomed constantly in his mind, even before its harsher later version was passed. The law reminded him that the federal government was willing to sacrifice human freedom for political compromise. Brown understood that his status could change overnight with a stroke of a pen. This awareness made him restless. Safety achieved through hiding felt insufficient. The law itself had to be confronted. Writing became Brown's next form of escape. Words allowed him to reach places his body could not safely go. Through writing, he could expose the system without being physically present. He could preserve memories that slavery tried to erase. Writing also allowed him to reclaim control over his identity. Naming his experiences in his own voice was an act of ownership long denied to him, yet writing also reopened wounds. Revisiting trauma was painful. Each sentence required reliving moments he might have preferred to forget. Brown accepted this cost because he believed forgetting was a greater danger. Memory, he understood, was a battleground. Slavery depended on distortion and silence. Testimony threatened it. Brown's escape also reshaped his understanding of courage. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was action taken despite fear. He remained afraid long after gaining freedom. What changed was his willingness to let fear dictate his choices. This shift was gradual and hard-won. Freedom demanded not just escape from chains, but resistance to intimidation. One of the most sobering lessons Brown learned was that freedom was unevenly distributed. Some fugitives were caught and returned, others disappeared, some found safety only to lose it later. Brown lived with constant awareness that his survival was not guaranteed. This knowledge fueled his urgency. Time mattered. Lives were at stake. Delay was dangerous. Schools often frame escape narratives as endings, but for William Wells Brown, escape was a beginning filled with uncertainty. It marked the transition from enforced silence to chosen risk, from survival to responsibility, from being acted upon to acting deliberately. Freedom did not resolve his story, it complicated it. Brown's life as a free man was shaped by tension, between hope and fear, safety and danger, individuality and obligation. He learned that freedom without justice was incomplete, that personal liberation meant little if the system remained intact. This realization pushed him toward activism with increasing clarity. Escape gave Brown distance, but not detachment. Slavery remained present in his thoughts, shaping his goals and methods. He did not seek to forget the past, he sought to confront it publicly. Freedom gave him a platform, not peace. He accepted this trade knowingly. By surviving escape and its aftermath, William Wells Brown crossed a threshold few did. He had seen slavery from the inside, survived its machinery, and emerged with both clarity and voice. This combination made him dangerous to the institution he had fled, not because he carried weapons, but because he carried truth. This chapter of his life is often told quickly, framed as triumph. But the truth is heavier. Escape did not end the struggle, it intensified it. Brown traded visible chains for invisible threats. He gained movement but lost certainty. Yet he also gained something slavery could never allow, the ability to choose his path. That choice, to speak, to write, to expose, would define everything that followed. After escaping slavery, William Wells Brown discovered that freedom gave him something more dangerous than mobility, a voice the system could no longer legally silence. He understood quickly that survival alone was not victory. Slavery depended not only on chains and laws, but on ignorance, on the ability to hide its realities behind distance, denial, and carefully crafted myths. Brown decided that if slavery had tried to erase his voice, he would answer by amplifying it. The pen became his weapon, sharper than any blade, because it could travel where his body could not and reach minds slavery feared most. Brown's first public weapon was testimony. When he began speaking at abolitionist meetings, audiences were struck by his calm precision. He did not rely on exaggerated emotion or spectacle. He described what he had seen plainly, almost clinically, trusting the truth to carry its own force. This unsettled listeners more than dramatic appeals ever could. Brown spoke as someone who had observed slavery from the inside and understood it as a system, not just a collection of horrors. He named places, practices, and patterns. He refused to let listeners imagine slavery as distant or abstract. Soon Brown turned to writing, recognizing its permanence and reach. Spoken words could be denied or forgotten. Written words remained. His narrative of William W. Brown, a fugitive slave, published in 1847, was not simply a personal story. It was an indictment. Brown structured his narrative carefully, weaving personal experience with analysis. He did not present himself as an exception or a curiosity, he presented himself as evidence. What made Brown's writing especially threatening was its clarity. He did not soften violence to protect readers' comfort. He described whippings, family separations, sexual exploitation, and psychological terror without euphemism. Yet he also refused to portray enslaved people as helpless victims. He showed intelligence, strategy, and resistance wherever he could. This balance disrupted dominant narratives that justified slavery by portraying black people as incapable or passive. Brown's writing also attacked the moral foundations of slavery directly. He challenged Christian justifications with surgical precision, pointing out how Scripture was selectively interpreted to support power. He exposed the hypocrisy of ministers who preached obedience while benefiting from enslaved labor. By doing so, Brown forced religious readers to confront their complicity. This was particularly dangerous in a society that used religion as moral armor. Mississippi and the Deep South appeared repeatedly in Brown's work, not as distant backdrops, but as central engines of cruelty. He described the cotton economy, the river trade, and the overseer system in detail, connecting individual suffering to national profit. Brown wanted readers to understand that slavery was not a regional anomaly, it was a pillar of American prosperity. This framing denied Northerners the comfort of moral distance. Unlike many white abolitionists, Brown did not argue for gradual reform or compromise. His writing suggested something more radical, that slavery was fundamentally incompatible with American ideals and must be dismantled entirely. He did not beg for sympathy, he demanded accountability. This tone distinguished him from other voices of the era and made him harder to dismiss. As Brown's reputation grew, so did the risks. Publishing his narrative exposed him to identification and capture. Slave catchers could use details in his writing to track him. Laws still permitted his return to bondage. Brown understood this danger and made a strategic decision: he would leave the United States. In 1849, he traveled to Britain, where he could speak and write without fear of legal capture. In Britain, Brown's pen became even sharper. Distance gave him safety, but it also gave him perspective. He addressed Tish audiences directly, explaining how their textile industries were tied to slave-grown cotton. He refused to let Britain claim moral superiority without acknowledging economic benefit. His lectures were popular and unsettling. Brown was not interested in polite applause. He wanted discomfort to provoke action. While abroad, Brown wrote more expansively. He began experimenting with forms beyond autobiography, recognizing that storytelling could reach people who avoided political tracks. This led to Clotel, or The President's Daughter, published in 1853, widely considered the first novel written by an African American. The novel was daring in both content and implication. By fictionalizing the rumored enslaved children of Thomas Jefferson, Brown struck at the heart of American mythology. Through fiction, Brown exposed truths that non-fiction could not always convey safely. He explored sexual exploitation, racial hypocrisy, and the emotional toll of slavery in ways that forced readers to empathize rather than observe from a distance. Fiction allowed him to bypass defenses. Readers who might resist direct accusation found themselves emotionally entangled before realizing what they were confronting. Brown's choice to write a novel was strategic. He understood that narratives shape identity. America told stories about itself that excluded or distorted black experience. Brown decided to enter that narrative space and rewrite it. He used the same literary tools white writers employed: romance, tragedy, irony, but repurposed them to reveal injustice. This was intellectual resistance at its highest level. Schools often overlook Brown's literary innovation, focusing instead on later black writers. This omission hides how early and how boldly black intellectual resistance emerged. Brown was not following a tradition, he was creating one. His work challenged the assumption that black authors could only testify, not create. By writing fiction, Brown claimed full artistic authority. Brown's pen also documented resistance. He recorded rebellions, escape attempts, and everyday acts of defiance that contradicted the myth of enslaved contentment. He understood that history was being written by those in power and that silence would erase resistance entirely. His writing preserved memory as evidence. Critics attacked Brown from multiple angles. Pro-slavery advocates dismissed him as bitter or unreliable. Some white abolitionists criticized his tone as too confrontational. Brown refused to soften his message. He believed politeness had preserved injustice for too long. Truth, he argued implicitly, did not need to be comfortable to be valid. Writing also became a way for Brown to reclaim time. Slavery had stolen his past, controlling his movements and labor. Writing allowed him to reconstruct his life on his own terms. He could revisit moments, analyze them, and place them within a broader narrative. This act of reconstruction was healing, but also political. It asserted ownership over experience. Brown's work circulated widely, influencing abolitionist thought on both sides of the Atlantic. His narratives were used in lectures, discussions, and organizing efforts. They armed activists with concrete examples that could not be dismissed as rumor. Brown became a source, not just a symbol. Importantly, Brown did not present himself as a solitary hero. His writing consistently acknowledged others, those who helped him escape, those who resisted openly and quietly, those who suffered without recognition. This collective framing challenged the individualistic myths that often dominate historical storytelling. Brown understood that slavery was collective oppression and that resistance was collective too. The pen also allowed Brown to expose the emotional cost of slavery in ways statistics never could. He wrote about grief that lingered across years, about relationships severed permanently, about fear that reshaped personality. These details anized enslaved people in a society invested in dehumanization. Readers could no longer pretend slavery was abstract. Brown's writing did something even more dangerous. It connected past, present, and future. He warned that slavery's logic, profit over humanity, law over justice, could survive even after formal abolition. This foresight would later prove chillingly accurate. Brown was not just documenting history, he was issuing a warning. By choosing the pen, William Wells Brown transformed from a witness into a challenger. He no longer simply described the system, he interrogated it. He demanded that readers locate themselves within it. Neutrality, his work implied, was complicity. This phase of Brown's life is often reduced to a list of publications, but that reduction misses the stakes. Every word he published risked backlash, erasure, or violence. Writing was not safe, it was chosen. It was defiance. Slavery had tried to make Brown invisible. The pen made him unavoidable. His words crossed borders, challenged myths, and forced a nation to see itself through the eyes of someone it had tried to silence. That was why his writing mattered, and why it frightened those invested in the old order. By the time Brown returned to America years later, the ground had shifted. His voice was established. His arguments were in circulation. He had proven that an enslaved man could not only escape, but could also define the narrative of his own oppression. This was not the end of his struggle. It was a turning point. The pen had opened a new battlefield, one where ideas clashed, histories were contested, and the future of a nation was being argued sentence by sentence. By the time William Wells Brown's voice had crossed oceans and reached audiences on both sides of the Atlantic, the reaction from the slaveholding world was no longer confusion or dismissal. It was fear, not loud fear, announced openly, but a quieter, more deliberate fear that expressed itself through bans, erasure, and silence. Brown had become dangerous in a way the system understood very well. He did not merely condemn slavery, he explained it, and explanation threatened the foundations of power more deeply than any single act of rebellion. In the American South, Brown's works were unwelcome to the point of prohibition. Slave states did not need to debate his arguments to understand the risk they posed. His narratives named names, described locations, and laid bare practices that Southern leaders insisted were exaggerated or benevolent. To allow his books into the South would have been to allow enslaved people access to language that articulated their own reality. That alone was unacceptable. Literacy among enslaved people was already feared. Literacy paired with truth was intolerable. But the danger Brown posed extended beyond the enslaved population. His writing also targeted the conscience of white readers, especially those who preferred distance and denial. By connecting Northern industry, religion, and politics to Southern slavery, Brown collapsed the comforting illusion that responsibility ended at state borders. This made him threatening not only to planters, but to businessmen, politicians, and clergy who benefited indirectly from the system. Banning his work was not just about controlling enslaved people, it was about protecting reputations. Censorship of Brown's writing was not always formal. In many cases, it took the form of exclusion. His books were omitted from libraries, his name was left out of curricula, his contributions were minimized in favor of white abolitionists whose critiques felt less destabilizing. This quieter form of silencing proved more effective than outright bans. It allowed society to claim progress while avoiding discomfort. Brown understood this tactic well. He had lived under a system that erased identity daily. He recognized erasure as a continuation of violence by other means. To be ignored was not a neutral act, it was a equal choice. Brown responded by writing more, speaking more, and diversifying his methods. If one door closed, he searched for another. One of the reasons Brown frightened the system was his refusal to accept partial narratives. He did not portray slavery as a moral contradiction that could be resolved through goodwill alone. He portrayed it as a structure embedded in law, economy, and culture. This meant that ending slavery required more than sympathy, it required dismantling institutions. That implication was radical. It suggested that comfort, wealth, and national identity were built on injustice. Brown's critics often accused him of exaggeration or bitterness. These accusations served a purpose. By framing his work as emotional rather than analytical, they attempted to discredit his authority. Brown countered this not by softening his tone, but by sharpening his arguments. He cited patterns, he compared regions, he exposed contradictions. His writing made clear that his conclusions were not reactions, but results. Another reason Brown was minimized was that he disrupted racial hierarchies within abolitionism itself. White abolitionists often positioned themselves as moral leaders, with formerly enslaved people serving as witnesses to suffering rather than thinkers. Brown refused that role. He analyzed politics, critiqued policy, and questioned strategy. He did not wait to be interpreted, he interpreted. This unsettled even allies who were uncomfortable sharing intellectual authority. Brown's novel Clotel intensified this discomfort. Fiction allowed him to explore subjects many reformers preferred to avoid, especially sexual exploitation and the hypocrisy of revered figures. By linking slavery to the private lives of American founders, Brown challenged the sacred narratives that underpinned national pride. He suggested that the nation's origins were not only heroic, but compromised. This was not a message institutions were eager to preserve. The banning and marginalization of Brown's work also reflected fear of precedent. If one formerly enslaved man could write with such authority, what would follow? Brown represented a future where black voices defined black history. That future threatened control over narrative, education, and memory. Silencing him was a way of delaying that shift. Brown also frightened the system because he refused to separate past from present. He argued that slavery's logic, profit over humanity, law over justice, did not vanish with changing statutes. This insight made his work relevant beyond abolition. It suggested that racial injustice could persist under new names and forms. For a nation eager to declare problems solved, this was deeply unsettling. Even after emancipation, Brown's work remained inconvenient. The post-slavery narrative America preferred emphasized reconciliation and progress. Brown's writing complicated that story by insisting on accountability. He did not frame freedom as a gift granted by benevolence, he framed it as something taken through struggle. This challenged the idea that the nation had redeemed itself fully through abolition alone. Educational institutions played a major role in this selective forgetting. Curricula favored simplified narratives that could be taught quickly and comfortably. Brown's work demanded time, context, and moral engagement. Teaching him seriously required confronting uncomfortable questions about law, religion, and economics. Omitting him was easier. There was also the issue of genre. Brown did not fit neatly into categories. He was a formerly enslaved person, a historian, a novelist, a political thinker, and an international speaker. Systems prefer labels. Brown resisted them. This made him harder to package, harder to teach, and easier to overlook. Brown himself was aware of these dynamics. He wrote about how memory is shaped by power and how history is often curated to protect those who benefit from it. He understood that silence could be as intentional as censorship. His persistence in the face of this silence was itself an act of resistance. What made Brown especially threatening was his calm. He did not rely on outrage alone. He wrote with restraint, clarity, and evidence. This denied critics the ability to dismiss him as hysterical or irrational. His tone communicated confidence and control. He wrote as someone who expected to be taken seriously, and that expectation itself was disruptive. Brown's marginalization also reveals something about how societies choose their heroes. Figures who challenge systems too directly are often softened or sidelined. Safer icons are elevated, those whose messages can be abstracted or depoliticized. Brown resisted abstraction. He insisted on specificity. He named Mississippi. He named the river trade. He named the law. This specificity anchored his work in reality, making it harder to mythologize and easier to fear. Even today, the relative absence of Brown's name from mainstream education is telling. It reflects ongoing discomfort with voices that connect historical injustice to contemporary structures. Brown does not allow readers to confine slavery to the past. He asks what replaced it, who benefited, and who still bears its costs. These questions remain unsettling. Yet Brown's influence persisted despite attempts to minimize it. His work circulated among activists, scholars, and writers who recognized their power. He helped establish a tradition of black intellectual critique that did not wait for permission. Later thinkers built on foundations he helped lay, even when his name was not always acknowledged. The fear Brown inspired was ultimately a measure of his effectiveness. Systems do not silence what is harmless. They silence what threatens to change understanding. Brown changed understanding by insisting that enslaved people were not merely subjects of history, but authors of it. That insistence reshaped the intellectual landscape, even when it was resisted. Banning a book does not erase its ideas. Sometimes it amplifies them. Brown's work gained a reputation not only for what it said, but for how power reacted to it. Suppression became proof of significance. Those who encountered his writing understood intuitively that it had touched something raw. Brown's legacy, then, is not only in the words he wrote, but in the reaction they provoked. Fear revealed truth. Resistance revealed impact. Silence revealed discomfort. Together, they form a map of how deeply his ideas cut into the foundations of American slavery and its afterlives. This is why William Wells Brown matters beyond his era. He shows how power responds when confronted with clarity. He shows how ideas can threaten systems more enduringly than violence. And he shows why forgetting is never accidental. William Wells Brown's story does not end with abolition, publication, or recognition. It ends, if it ends at all, in the uneasy space between memory and forgetting. The most revealing chapter of his life is not only what he did, but what happened after, how a man so influential, so widely read in his time, could slip into the margins of history. This final silence is not accidental. It tells us as much about how societies manage truth as any law or whip ever did. After slavery was formally abolished, the United States rushed to tell a story of redemption. The nation wanted closure. Emancipation was framed as a moral triumph, a cleansing moment that allowed the country to move forward without fully accounting for what had come before. In this narrative, figures like William Wells Brown were inconvenient. His work refused closure. He did not present slavery as a mistake corrected, but as a system whose logic could survive under new names. Brown warned that freedom without justice was incomplete. He understood that laws could change while power remained intact. Reconstruction, with its fragile gains and violent backlash, proved him right. Black Americans gained legal status only to face new systems of control, sharecropping, convict leasing, segregation, that echoed slavery's structure. Brown's analysis anticipated this continuity, which made his work harder to fit into a celebratory national story. Schools, as instruments of national memory, reflected these priorities. Education favored narratives that emphasized progress, unity, and eventual harmony. Brown's writing demanded discomfort. Teaching him seriously required grappling with the idea that American democracy was built alongside systematic brutality, not in spite of it. It required acknowledging that prosperity came at a human cost that could not be neatly contained in the past. Another reason Brown faded from classrooms is that his life challenges the hierarchy of historical voices. Traditional education often elevates presidents, generals, and lawmakers, those who held formal power. Brown held moral and intellectual power, not institutional authority. His influence came from clarity and courage, rather than office or title. Systems that privilege official power often undervalue voices like his, even when their insights are deeper. There is also the discomfort of proximity. Brown does not allow slavery to remain distant. He ties it directly to Mississippi's economy, the river trade, religious institutions, and legal systems. He names places students can still locate on a map. This concreteness collapses the safe distance that abstract history provides. It forces readers to confront how local and familiar the machinery of slavery was. Brown's refusal to sanitize trauma also contributes to his marginalization. His writing does not offer easy lessons or inspirational platitudes. It confronts violence, hypocrisy, and betrayal directly. For curricula designed to be broadly palatable, this honesty is often considered a liability rather than a strength. The result is omission disguised as simplification. Another factor is genre. Brown does not fit neatly into a single category. He was a formerly enslaved person, a historian, a novelist, a political thinker, and an international lecturer. Educational systems often prefer clear labels. Brown disrupts them. He cannot be confined to a unit on slave narratives or a brief mention in literature. Teaching him properly requires interdisciplinary engagement, which demands time and commitment many curricula avoid. Brown's international perspective also complicates national storytelling. He did not confine his critique to the United States. He spoke to British audiences, challenged global economic complicity, and framed slavery as part of a transatlantic system. This global framing undermines nationalist narratives that isolate injustice as a uniquely Southern or American flaw corrected internally. Brown shows how interconnected exploitation was, and remains. Perhaps most importantly, Brown threatens the myth of passive victimhood. He presents enslaved people as thinkers, strategists, and analysts of their own oppression. This challenges stereotypes that linger even in well-intentioned education. Recognizing black intellectual agency in the 19th century requires rethinking assumptions about who produces knowledge and history. Brown also disrupts timelines. He does not fit cleanly into before and after categories. His warnings about the persistence of injustice resonate uncomfortably with the present. Teaching Brown seriously invites students to draw connections between slavery, segregation, mass incarceration, and economic inequality. These connections are politically charged, which makes avoidance tempting, yet forgetting Brown comes at a cost. Without his perspective, history becomes flatter and less honest. Slavery appears as an aberration rather than a foundation. Resistance appears spontaneous rather than sustained. Abolition appears inevitable rather than contested. Brown's life reminds us that change required relentless pressure, risk, and sacrifice from those with the least protection. Brown also offers a model of intellectual courage that remains relevant. He did not wait for validation. He did not dilute his message to gain acceptance. He used every tool available, speech, narrative, fiction, history, to tell the truth as he understood it. In an era of misinformation and selective memory, this example matters deeply. Reintroducing Brown into education is not about adding another name to a list. It is about changing how history is taught. It means centering systems rather than heroes, voices rather than myths, and analysis rather than comfort. Brown teaches us to ask not only what happened, but who benefited, who suffered, and who decided what would be remembered. Brown's obscurity also reveals something hopeful. Despite suppression, his work survived. It was preserved, rediscovered, and re-examined by those who recognized its value. This persistence suggests that truth, even when marginalized, does not vanish. It waits. Today, as debates about history, memory, and education continue, Brown's life offers guidance. He reminds us that forgetting is an act, not an accident, that silence serves power, and that telling the full story is always a form of resistance. William Wells Brown was born property and died a free man, but his greatest achievement was neither escape nor publication. It was clarity. He saw the system that bound him, named it, and exposed it. He refused to let comfort override truth. That refusal is why his story matters, and why it has been so carefully, quietly set aside. To remember Brown properly is not to romanticize suffering or assign guilt without purpose. It is to recognize how deeply the past shapes the present and how narratives are curated to protect power. It is to accept that progress without honesty is fragile. Brown does not offer closure, he offers responsibility. His life asks readers and students to decide what kind of history they want, one that reassures or one that reveals. Teaching William Wells Brown fully means choosing revelation over reassurance. In the end, the hidden story of William Wells Brown is not just about slavery or Mississippi or the 19th century. It is about memory itself, about who gets to speak, who gets heard, and who gets forgotten. Brown fought his entire life against erasure. The least we can do is refuse to continue it.